In the suffocating heat of 1844, a chilling silence fell over the Langston plantation in Alabama. The cotton fields shimmered, a sea of white ghosts in the brutal sun, but the true haunting was a profound hush that clung to the air like a shroud. This was the world into which Maria was born, a world where truth was as malleable as the humid air. They told her that her mother had died in childbirth, her name lost to memory. But Maria remembered everything. She was a ghost in the grand house, a silent witness who absorbed every detail, the subtle creak of a floorboard under a specific foot, the hushed tones of voices behind closed doors, the medicinal scent of laudanum in Mrs. Langston's tea. By the time she was 25, Maria had become an indispensable shadow, unseen yet always present. Her movements were as quiet as smoke, her expression unreadable, her eyes heavy with the weight of unsaid truths. She served Mrs. Langston, a woman consumed by a fragile melancholia, her sorrow sealed in lace and silk, her hands trembling over letters from a distant doctor promising miracles. Maria prepared her teas, arranged her pillows, and stood watch through endless bitter nights as the house groaned with the silent weight of unspoken grief. Samuel Langston, the master, was a different kind of monster. He wore charm like a finely tailored coat, a man of God, a respected landowner, a friend to judges and generals. But behind the closed doors of his study, his voice dropped to a low growl, and his hands strayed with a predatory hunger. The enslaved whispered of him in hushed tones, using old words from the coast. Noki Mung, not a curse, but a warning. One fateful rainy evening, Maria was summoned to his study. She did not return until morning. No one asked, no one spoke, and as her belly began to swell, the silence around her became a deafening roar. Her cries were swallowed by the storm the night she gave birth alone in the servants' quarters. 2 infants emerged, twins with skin as pale as fresh cream and hair like damp straw. The sight of them sent a tremor through the plantation, a ripple that reached the main house like a shiver through solid stone. The overseer, Benton, was quick to act, ready to hide this undeniable transgression. But Samuel intervened. What passed between him and his wife that night is a story lost to time, but the next morning, the household was gathered to meet the miracle twins, Thomas and Eli Langston. They were said to be born through divine providence and the quiet hands of a doctor from New Orleans. Maria was not thanked, not even mentioned. She returned to her duties, her body sore and stitched, her heart a desolate cavern. She watched from the shadows as her children were suckled by another woman, as they learned to crawl on imported rugs and were christened in gowns she herself had folded. She was never their mother, only their servant. Whispers began to snake through the quarters. Some said the mistress had gone mad, others that the twins were cursed, wearing a stolen name. But no one dared speak too loudly, not when Samuel began burning letters and walking the halls with a pistol tucked beneath his coat. Maria did not cry. Instead, she memorized every lie, every trembling hand. Every night the house creaked with footsteps not meant to echo. She carved each detail into the silent vault of her mind. She understood now that her body had been a vessel for their lineage, a bitter soil in which they had planted a stolen legacy. But within that same soil, something else began to grow, something far more dangerous than grief or resentment. It was a patience that was boundless, a vengeance that was cold, and a power that was waiting. By 1851, the Langston twins were the pride of Wilcox County. Thomas, the elder, bore his alleged father's calculating gaze. Eli, softer and quieter, mirrored the mistress's melancholic detachment. Their story was repeated in parlors and prayer meetings, a sanitized miracle that no one dared question. In the South, truth was elastic, stretched and twisted until it snapped or was simply suffocated. Maria watched it all, her presence erased but never absent. They called her Mimi, a childish nickname permitted only because it sounded harmless. But when the children cried in the night, it was her hands that soothed them. She knew their fears, their dreams, the shadows that haunted them. She knew which books Thomas loved and which demons Eli fought. Samuel Langston, meanwhile, grew more cautious, his debts and dealings creating a web of enemies. He traveled more, returning with fine silks and foreign wines, but also with a darkness that clung to him. In his study, Maria found French pamphlets, letters with European seals, and a locked drawer that held the faint, sickening scent of rot. She never needed to open it. She knew. She had been their silent witness for 7 years, a mother erased, a secret buried alive, and in the heart of that dark silence, her power was steadily rising. The forgotten cell was not in the depths of a prison, but in the heart of a home, and the secrets it held were ready to be unleashed. She knew the scent of secrecy. It clung to the humid air of the drawing room one afternoon, as Maria, hidden behind heavy curtains, overheard a hushed conversation between Samuel and a northern stranger. The man spoke with an irritated urgency, mentioning lineage experiments, the necessity of silence, and a ledger named Varner. Samuel, his voice a chilling blend of threat and charm, simply exchanged money, and the secret was sealed. Weeks later, Mrs. Langston's body began to fail. Her skin turned a sickly gray, her eyes a jaundiced yellow. The doctor called it liver rot, a respectable death for a woman of her standing. But Maria knew better. She had seen this slow poison before in the quarters, in women who had been given bitter root brewed wrong. The mistress died without ever meeting Maria's gaze again. Her funeral was a quiet, joyless affair, a closed casket procession that only added to the house's profound silence. With the mistress gone, Samuel's grip on the boys tightened. They were no longer sons, but symbols of a stolen legacy, their lives choreographed to perfection. He corrected their posture, their speech, even their laughter, molding them into flawless replicas of a heritage that was not their own. And yet, in the quiet of the night, Maria would hear Eli's fragile questions whispered into the dark. Why don't we look like the others? Why does father avoid mirrors? Thomas never asked. He had already learned that the truth was a currency more dangerous than gold. Maria said nothing. She simply waited. She brewed their teas, mended their clothes, and sang them lullabies in a language that had been silenced for centuries. She was not a stone, but something else entirely now, a vengeance slowly growing, reshaped by fire and time, the ghost of freedom by the winter of 1863. The Langston plantation had become an island of fading aristocracy in a sea of blood and ash. The war had split the nation, but it seemed time itself refused to touch the Langstons, who were shielded by the illusion of their own status. Samuel, now moving with a rifle in one hand and a bottle in the other, saw his power wane as Union troops crept closer. He barricaded himself behind fine drapes and a tattered Confederate flag, clinging desperately to a legacy that was already crumbling. The twins, now nearing 20, had become mirrors of their own fractured existence. Thomas, hardened by war propaganda and whispered expectations, had grown into his alleged father's likeness, not just in appearance, but in the cold arithmetic of dominance. Eli, by contrast, retreated into himself. He filled journals with unanswerable questions, sketching faces he couldn't name and symbols he claimed to have seen in his dreams. Maria remained. Unshackled by law but not by practice, she moved through the house like a breath in the lungs of a dying man. Freedom, she realized, was not always an arrival. Sometimes it was a ghost that lingered, watching. Samuel's death, shot through the chest while fleeing a collapsing supply line, reached the plantation as slowly as a rumor. The Langston name, however, still held currency. Through their father's remaining connections, Thomas and Eli retained a threadbare version of their status. But the walls had begun to whisper. The very foundation of their lives was cracking. The papers Maria had once glimpsed now lay in plain sight. Maps of ports, coded inventories, and letters from the elusive Leopold Varner. These documents revealed not just Samuel's trade, but a darker ideology, engineered heritage, controlled unions, and the spiritual manipulation of bloodlines. Maria studied them in silence, leaving no trace. She listened as Thomas spoke of reclaiming his northern legitimacy, and as Eli sobbed after receiving a letter from a Louisiana woman who claimed to share his face. At night, the brothers tossed in a restless sleep, calling out to unseen figures. Their dreams were no longer their own, and still Maria remained. She began to rearrange small things. A book shifted, a candle left lit. On Thomas's threshold, she sprinkled crushed roots he couldn't identify. Near Eli's bedside, she placed dried herbs wrapped in cloth from her old garments. She walked barefoot through the halls at dusk, whispering in a tongue neither boy understood, but both began to fear. By 1867, the house was silent again, but with the hollow quiet of decay. The servants were gone, the friends no longer wrote. The land, once manicured with pride and pain, had turned wild, and in the tall grass near the stables, bones began to surface. Not human, but not altogether ordinary either. In that withering estate, Maria began to sing softly, slowly, in a cadence older than the house itself. It was not a hymn or a lullaby, but a calling. By 1871, the fragile peace of the post-war South had settled over Wilcox County like ash. Thomas and Eli, now young men, carried the weight of a name that wasn't theirs, their grand house nothing more than a hollow echo of its former self. And Maria, still present, still patient, still remembering, began the final act of her long, silent revenge. It started with a series of anonymous letters delivered to the Montgomery Advertiser. They were thin, brittle pages with singed edges, their ink faded. Each contained fragments of a truth the South was desperate to bury, the true lineage of the Langston twins, the correspondence of Leopold Varner, and the hidden accounts that revealed their mother, Maria, a woman enslaved, as their true origin. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. The documents were clinical in their precision, naming dates, times, and witnesses to the deliberate erasure of Maria's role. The town, once admiring, now recoiled. Social invitations vanished. Creditors called in debts with cruel precision. Thomas, prideful and brittle, fought to maintain a semblance of the family dignity he had been rehearsing for years, but it was a losing battle. Eli, fragile as glass, retreated into the shadows, his journals now smudged with tears and ink. The very air seemed to conspire against them, pressing down with the weight of exposure. Maria, meanwhile, moved unseen among the ruins of her former bondage. Her vengeance was complete. She had lived in the shadows for decades, a silent witness to a family built on lies. She had been soil, then a ghost, but now she was the earthquake that shattered them all. The crumbling legacy. The truth had begun its work, like a slow-acting poison. Thomas, desperate and clumsy, attempted to flee northward, clutching a stack of deeds and letters. He hoped to preserve the remnants of his stolen status, but his efforts were in vain. He became entangled in accusations of fraud and spiritual deceit, his name dragged through northern courts as an impostor, a hollow echo of the man he believed himself to be. Eli's descent was swifter, more tragic. The fragile structure of his identity, built on invisible threads of secrecy, snapped completely. One evening, he simply vanished into the darkness of the old well behind the stables. His absence wasn't a spectacle. It was a profound emptiness, a hush that spread across the plantation and lingered in the town, a silence heavy with grief and guilt. The estate, once a monument to Langston pride, began to rot. Windows shattered under storms and neglect. The roof sagged, and the walls bore the scars of time, but Maria remained. Though no one called her by her true name, whispers among those who knew her persisted. The woman who remembers. She moved among the collapsed furniture and overgrown paths, a silent witness to the consequences of the house's long-buried sins. She was untouched by ruin and unclaimed by freedom, a living record of a justice that was unfolding in its own slow, relentless manner. The Langston legacy crumbled, not by fire, not by violence, but by the relentless, unyielding truth remembered by a woman they had tried to erase. By the turn of the century, the Langston plantation was little more than a whisper on the wind. The cotton that had once gleamed like snow in the sun was gone, replaced by wild grass that swayed over the forgotten bones of animals and the ruins of a family's carefully constructed image. The past seemed to hum in the silence, and within that hum lingered the name of Maria, the woman who had birthed the twins and survived centuries of deceit. No one remembered her properly. Some said she had fled to the Caribbean, carrying with her knowledge that defied the laws of men. Others insisted she had died quietly, leaving only the faint scent of herbs and smoke behind. Yet each version of her ending bore the same truth. Maria had endured, observed, and orchestrated her own quiet reckoning. The twins' fate, one dead, the other wandering in shame, was the only visible evidence of her patience, of the slow, deliberate justice she had enacted without a word. Stories persisted among the descendants of the enslaved. They told of a woman with deep eyes who saw everything, who remembered faces, names, debts, and sins long after others had forgotten. Children claimed to hear her voice in the rustling of the grass, and elders swore they felt her gaze resting on them when they passed the plantation's broken gates. Maria had become a ghost, but not one of the departed. She was a living memory, a keeper of truth, a silent witness to the fragile illusions of power that men like Samuel Langston had constructed. A young historian, stumbling upon her story decades later, pieced together the bare outlines of Maria's life from fragile newspaper clippings and private letters. The historian found sepia-toned photographs of two white children with a woman of deep complexion, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. There was no smile, no sign of familiarity, only the quiet dignity of one who had endured the weight of a secret and the long march of injustice. For those who understood, Maria was no mere figure of the past. She was a force of memory, a living record of what happens when power is unchecked and lies are allowed to shape generations. The Langstons' heirs, the townspeople, the plantation itself, all became instruments of her silence, unfolding a truth that came too late for some and just in time for history to remember. Her name remained unspoken, her deeds largely invisible, but the impact endured. In the rustle of the tall grass, in the quiet corners of abandoned rooms, in the fragile pages of old letters, her presence lingered. The world had attempted to erase her, but Maria had outlasted it all.